Imagine walking into an inn where the floor oozes with fermented straw. Rats scurry underfoot, and the air reeks of rot and smoke. Forget roaring fires and jolly songs. Today you'll learn the horrifying truth about medieval inns, why they were filthy, dangerous, disease-ridden places that smelled of death and sin, and how surviving a single night inside was a feat of endurance. Dear viewers, my big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you subscribe, I'll keep creating even more fascinating and unique videos about life in the Middle Ages, and with your support, we'll get closer to that goal. I'm truly grateful to everyone who's helped me along the way. Now let's move into today's video. The image of a medieval inn glowing with candlelight, where weary travelers share bread and song beneath heavy beams, is a myth polished by stories, paintings, and modern fantasy. In this vision, the inn is a haven, warm, rustic, lively, a place of laughter and comfort, far from the cold dangers of the open road. But the reality was far more suffocating and foul, not a shelter from hardship, but a concentrated version of it. Beneath the veneer of fiction lay an experience few today could endure. The true medieval inn stank. Not metaphorically, the air was a thick, stagnant haze of unwashed bodies, spilled ale, rotting meat, smoke, animal filth, and human waste. The scent clung to skin, clothes, and breath. One did not merely enter a room, one entered a cloud of decay. The floor was rarely stone or wood, but hardened clay covered in straw meant to absorb filth. Yet the straw was seldom changed, fermenting into a soft paste alive with worms, beetles, and mold. Blood from old fights mixed with urine, beer, vomit, and the slop from overfull chamber pots, creating a microbial swamp just beneath the feet. Walls were little better. Constructed from cracked clay and straw, they were cold, damp, and permanently stained by smoke. There were no chimneys. Fires burned on the floor, and the smoke drifted upward, filling the rafters and clinging to every surface. Breathing in such spaces meant inhaling soot and grease. Furniture, if it existed, was rough and often broken, its surfaces greasy with tallow and old food. Tables were crusted with stains, benches wobbled or broke, insects danced in the haze. Rats crawled along beams, darted under benches, or gnawed breadcrumbs between boots. Dogs scavenged near the hearth, growling at one another over bones still streaked with meat. Nightfall turned the inn into a choking pit. With no separation between dining space and sleeping area, guests lay wherever there was room, on filthy hay, against the walls, or on benches. There were no sheets, no privacy. Everyone slept in the same clothes they wore for days, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same sour air. Snoring, coughing, groaning, even weeping, blended with the low growls of animals just beyond the doorway. Somewhere in the gloom, a man might relieve himself behind a post. Somewhere else, someone might vomit on the floor. No one cleaned it up. It soaked into the straw and stayed. And yet, people came. They came because they had to. Forests were lawless, roads dangerous, and nights too cold to spend outdoors. Inns were unsafe, but so was everything. Better to risk lice and theft than wolves and hunger. Pilgrims, soldiers, peasants, and traders alike crossed these thresholds, already resigned to the filth. To them, the discomfort was a given, the risk familiar. They slept in their boots and kept a hand on their purse. It was not hospitality they expected, but shelter, a fire, a roof, a meal that wouldn't kill them. Records from England, Poland, and Germany confirm the squalor. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of earth beneath former inns laced with parasite eggs, insect remains, and traces of human excrement. Drinking cups bear the residue of feces. Ceramic bowls were used again and again without washing. A study in York uncovered maggots and roundworm eggs in soil pulled from the floor of a 14th-century inn. These weren't exceptions. They were the norm. Even in their own time, inns were known for filth and danger. Church sermons railed against them as dens of vice. Civic records mention beatings, thefts, and poisonings within their walls. Some towns attempted regulation, ordering straw to be changed weekly, but enforcement was rare, and the rules were ignored. In a world without soap, sewers, or clean water, filth was everywhere, and inns were merely its concentrated form. The innkeeper stirred stew, while lice crawled beneath his collar. The guests clutched tankards of sour beer brewed in dirty barrels. The fire crackled, but smoke stung the eyes and soaked into every garment. To imagine a medieval inn is not to picture joy or song, but a space where survival was measured not in comfort, but in tolerance for filth, stench, and the relentless closeness of disease. A meal in a medieval inn rarely offered satisfaction and almost never promised safety. It was not served with warmth or care, but hastily and with indifference, thrown together from the cheapest remnants of what could be found, preserved or disguised. For the average traveler, food was not a comfort. It was a gamble, one that often ended in illness, pain, or worse. In a world without refrigeration, sanitary kitchens, or even basic knowledge of bacteria, the line between nourishment and poison was perilously thin. Bread, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, was often stale, rock-hard, and rough. It was made from coarse ground flour, sometimes bulked out with chaff, bark, or even sawdust during poor harvests. Bakers used what they had, and innkeepers purchased what they could afford, usually the cheapest and oldest stock. The crusts were brittle, the interiors often riddled with mold, and when dipped in ale to soften them, they dissolved into a foul-smelling paste. These loaves lingered on shelves for days, sometimes weeks, before being served to unsuspecting guests. Meat, when offered, was no more trustworthy. Inns rarely had regular access to fresh cuts. Most often, meat arrived preserved in salt, smoked beyond recognition, or beginning to rot and salvaged, only with liberal use of spices, vinegar, or strong herbs like mustard and pepper. Spoiled flesh was sliced, boiled, and drowned in thick broths in the hope that texture and taste would mask its condition. A stew might carry the sour sting of decomposition beneath its surface. In many documented cases, meat was obtained from animals that had died of sickness, old age, or causes unknown. Inspectors and laws did exist, but in isolated villages or border towns, they held little authority. For innkeepers, profit came first, and suspicion could be silenced with pepper. The most common meals were thick, greasy pottages, boiling vats of whatever ingredients remained from previous days. They simmered for hours, sometimes for days, replenished with scraps, bones, roots, and hunks of stale bread or cheese rinds. There was no consistency, no recipe, and no concern for balance. In these stews swam forgotten vegetables like turnips, leeks, or cabbage, often spoiled or fermented. The smell rising from the pot was heavy, often acrid, and when the inn was crowded, it merged with the overwhelming stench of sweat and smoke, becoming an unbearable miasma. Cheese, another staple, was a matter of fortune. In the absence of refrigeration, wheels aged in cellars became homes for mold, not the cultured kind, but unpredictable, blooming in greens, blues, and blacks. Ammonia-rich fumes wafted from cracked rinds, and in damp inns, the cheeses often sweated on the shelves, weeping pungent liquid. Still, they were served and consumed, sometimes regarded as delicacies, more often eaten with grim resolve by those who had no other choice. The same went for dried legumes or pickled vegetables, often fermented beyond recognition and laced with insects, dirt, or mold. And then there was the drink, the one substance consumed more than any food, the thing that filled every mug, bowl, and stomach: beer. Not the golden effervescent brew imagined today, but a cloudy, sour, gritty liquid, often barely fermented and never filtered. Medieval beer was weak in alcohol but potent in risk. Brewed in small batches using contaminated water, fermented in wooden barrels rarely cleaned, and stored in cellars crawling with pests, it bore the taste of mildew, iron, or decay. Its color varied from brown to grayish yellow, its surface often frothing with natural sediment. Yet it was drunk daily, not out of joy, but necessity. Water could not be trusted. Rivers and wells were fouled by waste, dead animals, or industrial runoff. Beer, boiled and fermented, at least killed some of what could kill you. Many innkeepers brewed their own batches in small back rooms or over smoky fires in the courtyard. Recipes varied wildly. Some added herbs for bitterness or supposed medicinal value, nettle, wormwood, or juniper. Others, more desperate or unscrupulous, laced their brews with substances meant to preserve or enhance flavor, including resin, lead filings, chalk, and even arsenic. These additions masked spoilage and increased shelf life, but they also killed. Court records from cities like Krakow, Bruges, and Nuremberg speak of mysterious deaths after a night of drinking, of travelers who vomited blood, or lay gasping until morning. In many cases, no one investigated. Deaths in inns were expected. It was simply the risk of the road. And yet beer was everywhere. It was drunk from dawn until night, by peasants, merchants, monks, and children alike. In many households, breakfast began with a mug of weak ale. In the inn, it was served with every meal, and between them, consumed in large quantities, not for pleasure, but because it was safer than water. Even the poorest drank it, even if the taste was foul and the residue clung to the bottom of the cup like rot. Over time, it was said, men became used to the sourness, just as they grew used to the smell of their own unwashed clothes. Illness followed. Stomach cramps, fever, diarrhea, and sudden collapse were so frequent they were rarely recorded. Guests who fell ill after a meal were left to shiver in a corner or carried out at dawn and dumped on the road. Some survived. Many did not. The food they ate and the beer they drank were not nourishment. They were hazards. But in a world where choice was a luxury, hunger was stronger than fear, and risk was part of every bite. In the inn, there were no menus, no expectations, no guarantees. A bowl of stew could be a meager comfort or a death sentence. A mug of ale could ease thirst or burn the stomach from within. The line between sustenance and poison blurred in the flickering firelight, and no one knew which side they stood on until the next morning, if they lived to see it. Among all the torments the medieval inn had to offer, perhaps the most relentless was the one that could not be seen or touched: the smell. It was not a single odor but a dense, layered assault, a vapor of decay that wrapped itself around the senses and clung like oil to skin and cloth. It seeped into every surface, every breath, and every moment spent within those crooked walls. For the medieval traveler, smell was not a detail. It was the atmosphere, the background radiation of daily life, and in the inn it formed an overwhelming presence, heavier than the smoke that blackened the rafters. The dominant note was human, the raw, acrid scent of bodies unwashed for weeks, of sweat soaked deep into fabric, of breath turned sour from rot and ale. Few had the luxury of bathing, and fewer still believed in its virtue. In many communities, immersion in water was viewed with suspicion, thought to open the body to disease. Soap, where it existed, was a rough block of lye and ash, expensive and abrasive. Clothing was worn until it stiffened, and linen undergarments, if they existed, were seldom laundered. The result was a human stench so pervasive that chroniclers occasionally described it not in terms of filth, but as a natural quality of the age. Over this base layer of sweat and grime drifted the odors of animals. Stables often stood adjacent to the drinking hall or shared a wall with the sleeping area. Horses steamed in the cold, their bodies exuding damp musk, their dung trodden into the clay floor and mixed with straw, meant to cushion weary heads. Dogs padded freely through the halls, snapping at scraps and fighting beneath tables, while their droppings festered unnoticed near doorways. Rats, ever present, nested in walls and rafters, emerging in the night to gnaw at stored grain or the feet of drunken guests. Their scent, A bitter mixture of fur, urine, and decay added yet another layer to the air's oppressive weight. Food contributed its own brutal share. In the damp corners of the kitchen, spoiled cuts of meat released a meaty, coppery funk that mingled with the vinegary bite of old beer and the pungency of fermenting cabbage. Cheese sweated in the heat, milk soured into curdled sludge, and bread developed a sour, moldy crust that crumbled in the hand. As the inn filled with heat, the smell of burning tallow, charred grain, and scorched grease coated the air, embedding itself in skin and fabric. Meals were taken amid these fumes, not apart from them. Guests chewed spoiled stew while swatting flies away from their cups, trying to ignore the scent of rot just inches from their plates. The alcohol that flowed from sunrise to nightfall only added to the cocktail. Beer and wine, often already spoiled, carried with them a sharp, acrid scent that burned the nostrils and soured the breath. Tankards left unwashed between guests developed a bitter residue, their rims crusted with spit and yeast. Spilled ale seeped into the floor and soaked the straw, which festered for weeks before anyone thought to replace it. In this way, the odor of alcohol was not a fleeting impression, but a permanent fixture, rising from every surface, steaming from every cup, sweating from every pore. And still worse were the latrine smells, not confined to outhouses, but mingled into the very architecture of the inn. Privies, if they existed, were often no more than overflowing pits near the rear wall or shallow ditches behind the stable. More often, guests relieved themselves behind the building, or, if too drunk or infirm to rise, simply in a corner or beneath the table. It was not uncommon for travelers to awaken in a pool of stale urine, or to find excrement nestled in the straw beside their heads. The scent of ammonia hung thick in the air, layered with the sharp tang of feces and the deeper, more ancient smell of soaked earth and waste. This stench was not incidental. It was constant, intrinsic to the experience of medieval life. Chroniclers sometimes wrote of it with disgust, but more often they described it plainly, not as something offensive, but as something expected. For the modern mind, it is almost unimaginable. But for the people of the time, it was background, as ordinary as the tolling of a bell or the barking of a dog. The smell of a medieval inn was the smell of survival and closeness to death. Inns in the Middle Ages did not promise comfort, and their beds, if they could be called such, offered less respite than a bare stretch of road. Sleep was not restful but dangerous, and every night spent beneath a common roof came with the quiet dread of infection. What the tired traveler encountered was not soft linen and solitude, but a communal space of wheezing breath, scratching fingers, and the invisible life swarming beneath layers of straw. A shared chamber served as both dining hall and dormitory. Once the drinking ceased and the last bowl scraped clean, guests pushed aside the tables or simply collapsed between them. In most inns, there were no private rooms or separate quarters. All slept together, rich merchants beside farmhands, pilgrims beside soldiers, women beside strangers, their bodies pressed close on damp hay or wooden boards. Snores clashed with drunken moans, and every cough or groan traveled through the darkness like a warning. The bedding itself was a hazard. Mattresses were rare, and those that existed were rough sacks filled with straw, sometimes leaves, often reused for years without being emptied. Over time, these fillings broke down, compacting into damp mulch that trapped fleas, lice, and mites by the thousand. Each guest who lay down added a new layer of sweat, filth, and flakes of skin. In the straw, vermin laid eggs, fungi spread, and microbial life multiplied without interruption. The straw became a living carpet of contagion. Even in wealthy cities, health records and legal documents reference guests who awoke covered in welts or stricken with fever. In towns like Gdansk, Lübeck, and Bruges, samples of in-floor soil have revealed extraordinary concentrations of parasitic eggs, from whipworms, roundworms, and tapeworms, alongside fungal spores and decomposed organic waste. These were not isolated outbreaks, but evidence of long-term, systemic infestation. The inn was not simply dirty, it was biologically saturated. Clothing offered little protection. Travelers wore the same garments day after day, and sleep rarely meant undressing. In winter, it was too cold to strip, and in warmer months, disrobing in a public room invited danger. Shirts stiff with sweat and cloaks caked in road mud became a second skin, pressed against infested bedding, absorbing whatever crept within it. In the morning, guests often left with more than they brought, lice crawling in their seams, red sores forming on their backs, and an itch that worsened with every mile onward. The threat was not limited to insects. Skin infections were rampant. Fungal rashes, open sores, and festering wounds spread easily in the humid, fetid atmosphere. Cuts received on the road became ulcers in the warmth of a packed room. The simplest scrape could turn septic. Without antiseptics or basic hygiene, even minor abrasions risked spiraling into fever and death. Physicians of the time, if consulted at all, spoke vaguely of bad air and imbalanced humors, but they had no understanding of contagion, only that certain places, like inns, were more likely than others to breed sickness. Rats made their homes in walls and rafters, slipping through cracks at night to forage. Their droppings mixed with the hay. Their fleas, after feeding on rodent blood, leapt to humans, delivering not just itching but death. The plague, in its worst waves, followed trade routes and pilgrim roads, and always found fertile ground in inns, where people gathered close and the rats were never far. When outbreaks struck, city officials often began by closing taverns and inns. Entire buildings were burned or abandoned. Innkeepers vanished, and their names became footnotes in death registers. Even those who survived their stay did not leave unchanged. The sleep they achieved was shallow, interrupted by noise, fear, or discomfort. They emerged from the stinking dark with aching joints, cracked lips, and eyes stung red from the smoke. Their dreams, if they came at all, were muddled by drink and sickness. Some left with visible sores or swollen bellies, early signs of dysentery or typhus. Others left with nothing more than a lingering cough, but that cough could grow until it became something far worse. The misery of these places extended to their keepers. Innkeepers and their families lived in the same filth as their guests, often with no greater protection. Their children played among fleas. Their partners cooked over fires that spewed black smoke into every crevice of their living space. They slept behind the bar or beside the hearth, enduring the same infestations and illnesses. Their trade, so essential to the life of the road, was also their curse. The very house that fed them became a cradle for disease. Travelers who could afford it sometimes brought their own bedding, a folded blanket, a sheepskin, even a personal straw mat. They ate from their own bowls, drank from personal cups, and kept a dagger beside their pallet. These precautions might reduce risk, but they never removed it. Disease did not respect the value of silk or the weight of a coin purse. It nestled in silence, deep in the straw, waiting for the warmth of another body. Despite all this, inns remained crowded. They were necessary. Forests were darker, monasteries overfilled, and village homes rarely opened to strangers. The inn, however dangerous, was the only place where the traveler could count on a roof, a fire, and, perhaps, a few hours of sleep. If the dirt and disease of medieval inns assailed the body, it was their atmosphere of unchecked violence and moral erosion that most deeply wounded the soul. These were not neutral spaces, nor even reliably hostile. They were volatile, unstable, and ruled not by law, but by mood. Behind every tankard of ale and every poorly patched curtain lay the potential for chaos, because the inn did not simply reflect the disorder of the medieval world, it amplified it. The density of people inside such spaces created a pressure of heat, noise, and human emotion that constantly teetered on the edge of collapse. Strangers were packed shoulder to shoulder, many drunk, some armed, all carrying the fatigue and frustration of the road. In the glow of tallow candles and smoky firelight, boundaries blurred. A spilled drink, a misheard word, a glance held too long. These were enough to tip a crowded room into violence. And once it began, it rarely stopped with a slap or shout. Innkeepers did what they could to maintain control, but their power was fragile. They relied on the coin of every guest, even the most dangerous. To eject a brawler might invite retaliation or drive away future business. Some turned a blind eye entirely, letting the room police itself. Others aligned themselves with local gangs, exchanging protection for coin or silence. This alliance between inn and underworld was neither rare nor hidden. City records from the 14th and 15th centuries routinely mention brawls, murders, and extortion plots that began or ended within a tavern's walls. Weapons were theoretically banned inside, but in practice, almost every traveler arrived with at least a dagger or short sword. The roads were too perilous to journey unarmed, and no one wished to relinquish their defense while sleeping among strangers. As a result, any conflict could escalate in seconds. Tables overturned, chairs splintered, knives found throats or bellies. A man might come to drink and leave bleeding, if he left at all. In the city of Dijon, municipal records from the 1300s show that over half of all murders occurred in inns. Similar patterns emerge in Krakow, Ghent, and Cologne. Wherever trade and travelers converged, blood was often spilled beneath the same roof that served soup and beer. But not all violence was sudden or fueled by rage. Much of it was predatory, calculated in shadow. Robbery was common, especially at night. A guest who fell into deep sleep, perhaps too drunk to guard his coin, might wake to find his purse gone or his traveling chest emptied. Sometimes it was fellow travelers who stole, but more often it was the inn's own staff or hired watchmen. In some cases, they worked with local criminals, providing lists of wealthy guests or unlocking doors at the right moment. For the victim, recourse was rare. Proving theft was difficult. Seeking justice in an unfamiliar town, often without local support, was nearly impossible. Worse still were the assaults carried out under cover of darkness. For women, especially those traveling alone or working within the inn, the danger was constant. Servants and kitchen maids were frequently the target of harassment, or worse. In the crowded, dimly lit chaos of night, there were few witnesses and fewer defenders. Inns were not built with locks or private chambers. A woman forced to sleep among men she did not know could expect no protection beyond what she could carry in her hands. And if a crime occurred, it was often she who bore the shame, accused of temptation, dismissed as a whore, or ignored entirely. Indeed, many inns blurred into brothels. It was not uncommon for the innkeeper to employ women who served dual roles, carrying dishes by day and selling their bodies by night. Some did so by choice, many by necessity, and a few under coercion. Cities occasionally passed laws to limit such activity, but enforcement was inconsistent. As long as the establishment paid its taxes and did not attract scandal, authorities looked away. The church, for all its condemnations, failed to close the door on vice. The same priests who denounced taverns from the pulpit were sometimes seen drinking behind their shutters. The moral atmosphere of the inn, therefore, was not just permissive. It was often hollow, drained of judgment or restraint. Sin, in the theological sense, was not hidden but saturated into the walls. Chroniclers wrote of walls soaked in wickedness, and the metaphor was not far from reality. Songs sung at night grew bawdy. Arguments over drinks turned to wagers, then to duels. Dice rolled in back corners. Coins vanished into palms. Women wept behind tapestries. Death slept beneath the tables. Some inns gained reputations so dark that locals named them accordingly. Hell's Gate, the Red Skull, the Bleeding Hearth. These were not branding decisions. They were warnings, passed between cart drivers, muttered by washerwomen, scribbled in the margins of travel records. Even professional soldiers, no strangers to blood or sin, avoided certain inns when they could, knowing that inns lurked not just danger, but a rot of the spirit, a descent into appetites too often indulged and too rarely punished. And yet, for many, there was no alternative. The road offered its own perils: wolves in the woods, thieves in the hedgerows, cold that could kill. The inn, for all its moral collapse, was still a place with a roof, a fire, a pot of stew, and perhaps someone willing to speak kindly, even if only for coin. Between sin and frostbite, the choice was rarely about virtue. Thus, medieval inns became not just places of rest, but theaters of survival, places where the weak were prey, the desperate gambled with dignity, and the line between host and predator blurred. In the shadowy world of medieval inns, where dirt, disease, and violence were constant companions, one figure remained both essential and suspect: the innkeeper. Neither fully welcomed nor entirely despised, he was the pivot on which the whole grim structure turned. Without him, the weary had no fire, the hungry no bowl, the merchant no shelter. Yet with him came unease, for the innkeeper was too often viewed as a facilitator of vice, a dealer in sin, a man who prospered from the misery of others while hovering just outside the boundaries of trust. He rarely resembled the hearty, jovial barkeep of folklore. More often he was haggard and alert, eyes always watching the room, voice coarse from shouting across crowded tables or haggling with suppliers in the cold dawn. His livelihood depended on balance, keeping guests fed and drunk, but not so drunk they broke his benches, welcoming travelers with coin, yet wary of those with too little and questions asked too late. Many were former craftsmen, failed farmers, or displaced widowers who inherited the trade, and they carried their pasts like stains on their aprons. Their hands, scarred from splinters and hot pots, were the hands of labor, not luxury. The innkeeper's role required him to be many things at once: cook, accountant, host, mediator, guard. He slept lightly, if at all, often near the fire or in a cramped corner behind a curtain, within reach of the hearth and the coin chest. He dealt daily with spilled blood, broken furniture, and violent drunks, yet had to rise early to salt meat or brew ale before the day's trade began. When the weather soured, when the sick crawled in from the road, or when thieves demanded shelter, it was his judgment, not law or scripture, that decided who stayed and who was turned away. In the public eye, however, he bore an almost folkloric blame. Clerics denounced him from the pulpit, depicting him as the keeper of damnation's threshold. In moral plays and sermons, he appeared not as a merchant, but as a tempter, one who filled cups with sin and offered beds of shame. His establishment, especially if it harbored prostitutes or gamblers, was likened to a mouth of hell, a den in which demons whispered between drink and dance. Urban records and court logs show how frequently innkeepers stood accused, not merely of neglect or overcharging, but of theft, poisoning, harboring criminals, and even murder. Some, indeed, foremost dens of depravity. Others were merely caught in the currents of need and compromise. It was not uncommon to read of tavern owners diluting wine with ditch water, selling meat scraped from the floor, or accepting coin to look the other way while crimes unfolded in the next room. A few made a living not by feeding, but by betraying, selling the whereabouts of fugitives or facilitating silent deaths in return for a heavier purse. Yet not all innkeepers were villains. Many operated on the brink of ruin, struggling against inflation, seasonal famine, disease outbreaks, and violent guests who left without paying. They borrowed constantly to restock their cellars, relying on credit from brewers or grain merchants who themselves offered little mercy. If food spoiled or the ale went sour, they swallowed the loss. If a fight erupted and the furniture shattered, they patched it by hand. Their buildings, often made from clay and wood, required constant repair. Their families, wives who stirred pots, sons who swept the floors, daughters who ladled stew or brewed weak ale, bore the same burdens, aging early, eating last. These households lived immersed in noise, filth, and unpredictable danger. A door might burst open at midnight, not with guests, but with swords. A traveler might collapse with plague on the floor. Local lords might seize the cellar during a levy. Everything rested on the innkeeper's ability to stay one step ahead of misfortune, to read a man's posture before he drew a blade, to water down the beer without insulting a knight, to choose whether to hide a hunted man or betray him before the bailiffs arrived. His survival depended not on law, but on instinct. Some communities came to depend on him in deeper ways. He knew who traveled where, who owed whom, who whispered what in the dark. His inn was a kind of clearinghouse for secrets, trade, gossip, and escape. A cunning innkeeper could manipulate this information into power, bartering knowledge for protection, trading silence for favors, sometimes rising to the edge of local influence. In towns where literacy was rare, he might be the only one besides the clerk who could read, count, or write. And so, though his presence was resented, it was also quietly indispensable. Over time, this contradiction hardened into stereotype. The innkeeper was the man who smiled too quickly, poured too generously, and always knew too much. He was caricatured in stories and condemned in verses, yet everyone stopped at his door. For the medieval traveler, reaching an inn at the end of a long day on treacherous roads did not mark the end of danger, but merely the crossing of a new threshold, one just as uncertain, lawless, and threatening as the forests and plains left behind. The decision to seek rest within four walls was often made not from trust, but from exhaustion, hunger, or dread of what might lurk beneath the trees. Yet what awaited inside could just as easily be theft, illness, humiliation, or death. Travelers moved through a world without clear maps or consistent shelter. Weather could turn cruel in minutes, roads vanished into marshes, and strangers rarely welcomed a knock on the door after sundown. The inn, therefore, became a reluctant necessity, a place not sought, but endured. Pilgrims trudging toward shrines, merchants bearing heavy wares, messengers galloping between courts, all of them, sooner or later, found themselves under the warped beams and leaking thatch of the local tavern lodging, their safety entrusted to a landlord they'd never met, surrounded by men they couldn't name. The experience of arrival was rarely reassuring. Entry into the inn meant instant immersion in heat, noise, and stench. The smell of fermented straw, human sweat, old blood, and spoiled food mixed into something dense enough to halt breath. The air was thick and wet, curling into clothing, soaking into bags and hair. Behind the counter, a wary innkeeper surveyed the guest, measuring their wealth, their strength, and whether they might cause trouble or attract it. If the guest was fortunate, a sleeping space might be offered, a corner of the common room, a place on the floor beside the hearth, or, in rare cases, a cot in a chamber shared with a dozen others. Privacy was non-existent. Women and men, rich and poor, sober and drunk, all pressed together like cattle in a stall. Theft was a constant fear. Many travelers, even among the better off, kept their coin purses sewn inside their garments or tied to their limbs while they slept. Some clutched daggers through the night, never closing both eyes at once. The threat of violence was never far. Travelers, by definition, were outsiders, unfamiliar with local feuds, ignorant of unspoken rules, and often assumed to carry valuables. A lone man, even armed, was an easy mark for a group of bored youths or embittered laborers looking to release tension through fists or blades. Sometimes danger wore no open threat. A guest might be welcomed warmly, fed generously, offered strong drink, only to wake up penniless or poisoned. Accusations were pointless. Witnesses looked the other way. Justice belonged to the locals, and the road moved on without remembering names. Food and drink, though presented as comfort, added their own risks. A stew might mask spoiled meat. A mug of beer might be so sour it blistered the tongue. A traveler who refused to eat was considered rude, possibly suspicious. A traveler who did eat might spend the night shivering in a corner, stomach twisted, eyes burning. In some regions, innkeepers were rumored to brew black ale, drinks steeped with herbs, or worse, capable of dulling senses or rendering the drinker defenseless. Whether these tales were true or not, enough men had vanished on the road to keep the fears alive. Women fared no better, and often far worse. Those who traveled alone were subject to constant scrutiny. Even those accompanied by servants or disguised as pilgrims found little protection once the shutters closed. Any woman within an inn, particularly after nightfall, was often assumed to be for sale or simply unprotected. Assaults were frequent, reports rare, and consequences almost unheard of. Female travelers were sometimes forced to sleep in kitchens, stables, or even chained rooms, more to prevent scandal than to offer safety. And even then, safety was never guaranteed. But even for those who passed the night untouched and unrobbed, comfort remained a stranger. Beds, if they existed, were infested. Blankets were damp and foul-smelling. The noise never stopped. Dogs fought under tables. Men snored like oxen. Someone retched in the corner, and laughter rose too quickly into shouting. In the dark, boots thudded without warning. Doors creaked. Someone screamed or sobbed into the straw. The smell of burning tallow and soured beer thickened as the fire died. The dreams of travelers were filled with smoke and shadows, and morning brought little relief. Departure came early, often before the first light. The door creaked open onto a foggy road. Eyes stung from the smoke, limbs ached from the floor. Coin was demanded for the night's hospitality, and those who hesitated faced threats. Some inns charged fees for invented damages or withheld horses until debts were cleared. It was not uncommon for guests to leave behind boots, knives, or other possessions as payment, or to vanish before dawn, sneaking away in silence to escape the final bill. And yet, despite every warning and every horror, inns remained vital to medieval life. They stood at crossroads, outside city gates, along rivers, near markets, grim oases in a landscape of exposure and uncertainty. The traveler could not avoid them. He could only hope to pass through them with his body intact and his purse uncut. Because even the worst inn, however dangerous, was still better than a night in the woods, where wolves howled, outlaws lurked, and the cold waited in silence. Between a frozen ditch and a stinking floor, most chose the floor. And between starvation and spoiled stew, most took the stew. Long after the fire was doused, the beer soured, and the laughter turned to silence, the medieval inn remained etched into the collective memory of Europe as a paradox, a shelter soaked in danger, a necessity rotted through with cruelty and neglect. It was neither wholly damned nor celebrated, but suspended in a moral gray zone, existing because the world around it was more brutal still. No city could function without them. No road could be traveled long without their roofs, and yet their presence carried the weight of everything unspoken: filth, vice, despair, and survival. In the town records of Bruges, Ghent, Prague, and York, references to taverns and inns appear not as footnotes, but as fixtures of civic life. Taxes were levied on ale barrels, disputes over stolen goods were traced back to barroom scuffles, and innkeepers often appeared before local courts, sometimes accused, sometimes petitioning for protection or compensation. Laws were written to regulate their operation: how many beds they could offer, what quality of food they must serve, even how often they should change the straw. These laws were rarely obeyed and even more rarely enforced. The authorities needed inns as much as they feared them. Inns served as hubs of information and contagion in equal measure. When plague crept across the continent, authorities often identified inns as the first points of transmission. Travelers carried more than wares. They brought rumors, spores, fleas, and fevers. The Black Death moved not just through ports and fairs, but through roadside taverns, where pilgrims coughed into their bowls and traders died in upper rooms. During outbreaks, cities sometimes shuttered their inns first, suspecting them of harboring the sick and the dying. In some regions, abandoned inns were burned to the ground without ceremony, their walls considered irredeemable, the disease too deeply absorbed to cleanse. Yet even in this decay, the inn retained a strange allure. It was the only place for many where the barriers of class and calling dissolved, if only for a night. Knights sat beside farmers, monks beside thieves. A man might trade a story for bread or a song for a blanket. Even as cruelty flourished within their walls, so too did the rare spark of camaraderie. There were moments when strangers shared firelight, not in violence, but in something resembling community, forged not from kindness, but from the mutual recognition of hardship. The inn also became a mirror for how people of the time understood sin and salvation. To stay in an inn was to expose oneself to temptation, to disease, to death, but also to the possibility of redemption. Pilgrims stopped there on the way to shrines, confessing sins between gulps of ale. Merchants recited prayers before sleep, even after losing money at dice. A man could stumble drunk from a brothel chamber in the attic, then pay a traveling friar for absolution over breakfast. It was absurd, contradictory, and deeply human. A world in miniature, compressed into one smoky room beneath a leaking roof. With time, the image of the inn began to shift in literature and lore. In early ballads it remained a den of vice, but later works romanticized its chaos. In the tales of Boccaccio, Chaucer, and countless folk epics, the inn became a stage for moral lessons, social satire, or lewd farce. The filth was not erased, it became part of the comedy. The lice, the fighting, the foul beer, all were recast as texture, as setting for the drama of flawed men and women trying to scrape a life together. The danger did not vanish, but it was softened by nostalgia, blurred by the distance of time. Even so, the truth remained buried in the straw and stone of surviving foundations. Archaeological digs across Europe, from the Baltic to the Pyrenees, have unearthed the raw legacy of these places: parasites in soil, bone fragments in kitchen refuse, scorched timbers blackened by centuries of smoke. In London's Southwark, beneath layers of urban sprawl, lies the outline of a once bustling inn, its hearth cracked and its latrines still faintly traceable. In Krakow, diggers uncovered a tavern wall inscribed with tally marks, possibly debts or scores, a memory of loss etched in crumbling plaster. What survives, more than the walls, is the atmosphere. The cold breath of damp stone, the groan of timbers, the invisible press of too many bodies in too little space. The medieval inn is gone, but its memory lingers in stories, in ruins, and in the language of suspicion that still clings to certain corners of hospitality. The word hostel shares its root with hostel. The term public house still carries a whisper of the civic duty that once tried, and failed, to control the madness within. Today, when one steps into a cozy inn with polished wood, clean linen, and the scent of lavender on the air, it is easy to forget how recent such comfort truly is. For centuries, an inn meant something very different. Not a retreat from danger, but a confrontation with it. A trial of endurance, a test of luck, a night among strangers where safety was uncertain. And the best one could hope for was to wake up intact. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.